For some reason, my computer erased the chapter number, so I'll just say next chapter. What's the deal? He woke because she had moved. He kept his breath still and even, like he was still sleeping, and waited to see what she would do. After a few minutes of nothing, he figured that she was still sleeping. He breathed in her hair that was still strong with that enticing sweet spiciness. Gently he lifted his hand, letting it slowly unstick from her sweaty face. Carefully he moved his shoulder without disturbing her, and then he reached over to the table. As he opened a drawer, it squeaked. He froze, waiting. But when she didn't move, he continued and retrieved the tool, and then brought it back slowly over to him. He held the tool poised above her head, and wham! She slammed her head into his. Since he really wasn't expecting that reaction, considering he thought she was asleep, he flipped himself and her over as he unwrapped his arms and legs that were encircling hers, and then he released her, adding a little push, too. Now trapped between him and the wall, she quickly scrambled away from him and pressed herself up against the wall and squished herself in the corner opposite him. Because his legs were blocking her from exiting the bed, which he had on purpose kept that position. Her eyes scanned the room thoroughly as they searched out every nook, every cranny, and every crack in the wall. And as she did this, all the while she still kept an eye on him and any move he made. He sat up and shoved his pillows behind him, but kept his long legs stretched. She eyed him, then his pointed shoes, then the door, and then back to him. He gestured to the door, which she looked at, and then back at him. He shook his head, then two-finger beckoned her. Her eyes narrowed, then bounced with a little anger at him. Again he pointed two fingers at the door, then shook his head, and then slowly two-finger beckoned her again, to him. She cautiously followed his gestures, then looking at him, she growled. He tried unsuccessfully to hold back his chuckle as he remembered that sound from the night before. "Oh, so you did growl at me last night," he said, amused. She squinted as his mouth moved. "And I'm guessing that you still cannot hear," he said as he adjusted his sitting position. When he moved, his legs moved, and she saw an opening. She started to leap over his legs, but he was too fast and his legs were too long. Mindful of his own pointed shoes, he caught her by the neck with his right ankle, and all the rest of her with his other leg, and then rolling his legs gently, he dropped her back into place. But she didn't stay dropped for long. Within seconds she was back in her corner, her eyes fierce, with her back up like a wild animal, even though she was smushed in the corner. Calmly he shook his head at her and tried a simple approach. "You have something in your ears," he said, hoping maybe she could lip read. Her head tilted to the side, but her eyes stayed fierce. He sighed, saying, "Nope, I guess you can't." Again her eyes curiously searched the room, still keeping an eye on him, but this time, every time she looked at him, she angry-eyed him. A few times, just for fun, he scratched his chin, or messed with his hair, or just stretched, and then would watch her overreaction as her eyes criticized his every move. It's not that he wasn't sympathetic to her situation. In fact, he knew what she was going through. As a little kid, some of the neighborhood bullies played this same trick on him. He remembered being a scared little guy wandering the woods. He was unable to hear, see, and smell, as well as he could not speak for what seemed like forever, until his mother finally found him. She cradled him in her arms and made everything better. He looked at the wild creature on his bed, thinking, "If only you would let me do the same for you." Covering his face, he rubbed his eyes, but then sensing her move, he sneaked a peek at her, through his fingers. Her head was tilted as she looked up at the window. Her eyes looked thoughtful, until he moved, uncovering his eyes, so then she was back to angry-eyeing him again. A shadow flew past, and she glanced up at the window again, but then quickly back at him. Trying something, he looked away, and sure enough, when he looked away, she looked up at the window. So it seemed, as long as he wasn't looking at her, she would move. It reminded Seth of a guy he had met at one of his construction sites. The guy did pipe repair, which that job was perfect for him because his kind could, depending on what they ate, grow or shrink, pretty much on command. Well, one day the guy was working in a pipe and then just disappeared. When he finally came back out, the guy said that when he fell in, he was down in a hole, feeling so small, and then when he suddenly found some unusual fungus, and he ate it. After he ate it, he claims that he was chased by ghosts, but they only went after him when he wasn't looking at them. I mean, he was a cool guy, but a little weird, and that fungus might have been bad because when he came out of the pipe, he looked a little green. Seth looked back at her. She glanced at him, but her head stayed tilted up toward the window. Her angry eyes were just wary eyes now, which made him wonder, why was she so defensive? He could understand because of the confusion, her reaction, and everything last night, but why had she woken up and then stayed like that? He had never harmed her in any way, but then he remembered the shopkeeper's words. Maybe that's why, he thought, glancing away as he put his hands behind his head. So now he wondered how he could change her thinking, at least until he got what he wanted from her. She saw his relaxed look as he looked away, while still watching him, and she began moving up the wall toward the window. "Go ahead," he said, looking at the window and shrugging, even though he braced himself in case he had to move fast. She continued to eye him. She moved up the wall and opened the window door a little more, pulling it open into the room while still keeping him in view. Taking a chance, she peeked her head over and looked out, and he saw the frustration just fall on her face. He pointed 2 fingers at the window, and she quickly looked back at him, eyeing him as he said, "Yeah, it's a pretty good drop. I would not try getting out that way." She squinted at him, still not understanding. "Maybe I should just let you figure it out," he said. But she wasn't looking at him. Her attention was drawn to something outside, and for a moment the face of the wild creature changed. A small smile softened her eyes. Curious, he leaned forward to see what had tamed the wild. Sitting on a branch was a little bird. Of course, the moment that he moved, the wild was back. Her head snapped to him, her fierce eyes criticized. Whatever he was doing, what he had done, what he planned on doing, and if any changes needed to be made to her continued surveillance of him. It must not have needed any changes, because seconds later she returned to looking out the window. "Wow," he thought, "and they call me a wild animal. Of course that's mostly at parties." He glanced away as he sat back and shook his head, wondering what he should do next. When he glanced at her, he was surprised to see that her eyes looked sad, and without looking he could hear why. The bird was singing, which he could hear, but she could not, and she knew it. She started messing with her ears while trying to hide it from him by pushing her head against her shoulders. He sighed. He needed her to trust him, but how? Trying to think was becoming difficult because of that twittering bird outside. And then he remembered something his mother had taught him. Now, if he could just remember how to do it, and how to do it correctly. He practiced a few times, then silently he called, which then turned into a real call. Of course, it would only work if she wasn't in the way. Using the side of his shoe, he nudged her. She immediately dropped down, hissing and growling at him. Her sad, curious eyes changed to anger in an instant. A shadow crossed over his legs, which made her look up, and her face changed again. Shocked eyes darted around, following the bird that had flown into the room. Her face lit up as she watched it fly about and then land. Her smile disappeared when she realized the bird had landed on his outstretched fingers. Her eyes moved slowly back and forth between him and the bird, but instead of anger or fear, she just looked confused, as she realized the bird was listening to him. He continued softly calling to it, keeping it perched on his fingers, While she was with criticizing curiosity, she watched his mouth as it moved. That is, until she noticed that he was looking at her. She backed up, giving him that untrusting look again. He reminded himself not to look directly at her, so instead he stared at the bird, while fighting the urge to snap its neck, which became a lot easier when he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. It took a few minutes, but finally she moved, very slowly, just like a wild animal, her paw lightly testing the ground before setting it down, then followed by the next paw lightly testing the ground. As she slowly crawled, he wondered how far would she go for this bird. While her eyes focused on the bird, he ever so slowly moved his outstretched arm to over his lap, baiting her to come nearer. He remembered to keep his eyes off of her as he continued calling to the still, oh so annoying, singing bird. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw her paw-like hand attempt to step on his stomach, but then quickly withdrew. He almost smiled, but reminded himself to stay attentive at appearing unattentive to her. Tilting his head slightly away from her, he continued to slowly move the bird back away from her. But then he stopped. He had an idea. With her on his left, he moved the bird closer to his face, but faced the bird away from her and tilted his head toward it as if he was listening to it with his left ear. He couldn't see her, but he could sense her movement as she moved closer. Then, after he gave it a few more seconds, he slowly started moving the bird back across him to his right ear. Curious, he chanced to peek at her. That dumb bird had her mesmerized, and it had her leaning over his lap as she tried to get closer to it. This is going to be interesting, he thought, as he slowly continued moving the bird to his right, while still pretending to communicate with the bird. But now even more so it would look like he was really focused. His brain cringed from the piercing annoyance, but it was working. She was now leaning over his chest, her head almost in line with his. Both of them appeared to be focused on the bird, but when he chanced a quick peek, he saw that whereas her head was turned toward the bird, her eyes were staring elsewhere. Out of the corners of her eyes, she was watching every move his mouth made. She had the most fascinated yet skeptical look as her eyes began moving back and forth between the bird and his mouth. He stopped moving the bird away from her, but continued his bird song, sometimes making the noise, sometimes just mouthing silently, so that she would continue to watch his lips move. He knew it was risky to look directly at her, but he couldn't help it. She had started making little movements with her mouth, trying to imitate him, while she glanced back and forth between him and the bird. He watched her look back and forth over and over until, without warning, those piercing green eyes were looking in his. His whistling came to an abrupt stop as they stared at each other. He felt like a deer caught in the firelight, all while the hunter inside him stirred. Once she realized he was staring at her, she turned her head to him, but angled back in a mistrusting way as she stared back at him. His fingers twitched, and he let go of the tool that had been, this whole time, holding on to in his other hand. Now he really wanted to throw the bird against the wall, to free both of his hands for the snaring. But when her eyes moved back to the bird, the spell was broken. She looked confused, and he realized it was because the bird was quiet. Not that she could hear it, but she could see that its beak was not moving. Softly he began whistling again. Her eyes flashed back to his lips, and then to the bird when its beak began moving again as well. He no longer hid that his eyes were watching her as she looked back and forth at the bird and his lips and his eyes, but her confusion grew stronger with each pass. Then the sadness in her eyes that was hiding behind the confusion revealed itself, and she dropped back away from him and sat down on her feet. Holding up both of her hands, she softly clapped them then held her hands up by her ears and clapped again. She turned her head and looked at the door, then the bird, then back down again. She looked lost. He leaned his head toward her. Sensing the movement, she gave him a guarded look, but she didn't move back away. Using 2 fingers, he tapped the side of his head. She glanced up to where he was tapping, blinked a few times, and then looked a little further up on his head. The questioning look on her face confused him until he realized why. "Oh, yeah, my ears are higher up than yours because I'm only half man. Well, actually, I'm all male," he said, chuckling, until he remembered that she couldn't read lips. Or maybe she could, just maybe not that fast, he thought. So he corrected himself and made sure to pronounce his words clearly and slowly so she could read them. "I am half Vastaya, half human," he said, indicating himself. With a tilted head, she watched his lips, scrutinizing the word Vastaya. Then, after a pause, she nodded. He breathed a sigh of relief and smiled. Finally they were communicating. She was looking at his ears again. He tilted his head toward her in offering, but she backed up and shook her head at him. He put his head back and sighed. How odd that her rejection made him feel alien, and her not wanting to touch his ear kind of made him want her to want to touch his ear. "I guess we'll try this again," he said, taking a deep breath, and he lifted his left hand. She was looking elsewhere, but her head jerked back to him as soon as he moved. He nodded down at the metal object sitting next to him. She looked at it until he started to pick it up. Although she didn't move away from him, her back angled away from him. She was looking at the object with raised and guarded eyebrows, and when she glanced at him, a bit of the anger and mistrust was back. He sighed. "You're never going to let me do this, are you?" Then he had an idea. Of course, the bird, which had fallen asleep on his hand, was going to have to go. He bounced his hand just enough that it woke up and took off. It circled the room twice, then flew out the window. She didn't understand, and now was confused and alarmed. Then she turned her green eyes sad and accusing on him. He felt an ache in his upper back, like maybe he had been sitting too long, and also now he was thinking that maybe he should have kept that bird around a little longer. He tried to smile. "I can get him back," he said, as he reached into his pocket. Looking at those sad eyes, he paused, with his hand in his pocket, and added, "And I will get you all the birds." Her tilted head and confused look reminded him that he had spoken too fast for her to follow, but he figured it was best to get on with fixing the bigger problem than to worry about the smaller one. Slowly, he pulled his hand out of his pocket and held out a knife to her. Her eyes grew big with recognition as she took it from him. Again those green eyes accused him, but he shook his head, saying, "I didn't take it. It wasn't me." Her eyes narrowed as she judged his answer. He smiled and calmly added, "No." Her eyes relaxed, but she still eyed him. He reached up and pointed at his ear again, and then hers, and slowly said, "You have something in your ear." She shook her head, answering no. "Yes, you do," he said, nodding his head. She stuck her finger in her ear and wiggled it as she shook her head, her eyebrows raised over large eyes as if saying, "See, no, I don't." He reached over to stop her. "Yeah, you do, and you're going to make it worse if you do that," he said, but of course too quickly for her to follow. She stopped as she tried to read his lips, but when he moved to touch her, she leaned back away from him. Sitting back, he nodded his head with each word. "Yes, you do." Then added, "Trust me." She just stared at him, then shook her head. He closed his eyes and sighed, thinking, well, that's what the knife is for, so here goes. "I will show you." he said, holding up the tool. Again she took the defensive. He laid the tool on the bed, held his hands flat in the air to show her no harm. He leaned in, looked right into her green eyes, and whispered, "I won't hurt you." Unfortunately, the word hurt was not easy for her to read, so the lip motion confused her. He fumed, thinking a moment. Then he pointed to his arm, then his other arm, and then her arm. She mouthed, "Arm." He nodded and smiled, so excited that he almost forgot the other part. She was taken aback by his reaction to her mouthing "arm," but her expression became even more curious when he started panting at her, followed by pointing at his arm again. She mouthed the word "harm." Again he nodded happily, then leaned in and whispered to her, adding, head shake in the middle, "I won't harm you." Then he gently pinched the tip of the knife, adding, "But you—" She tried to pull it back, but he kept pinching and pulling it toward him. Looking at him curiously, she stopped resisting and let him pull it and her hand up to his neck, where he placed the tip at his throat. "You can hurt me," he finished. He hadn't said it slowly, but she seemed to get it. Her eyes grew large as she stared at the tip laid against the target. Then she looked up at him, and oddly, for the first time since this whole thing started, she seemed calm. He kind of hated having to disturb her, but he needed to finish, so, reaching up, he grasped her knife, which caused alarm, which he ignored, while he readjusted himself to sit cross-legged and face her, all while he held her hand and kept the knife resting at his throat. She looked alarmed that her back was to the wall, but he smiled at her reassuringly, then gently squeezed her hand, helping her push the tip of the knife just a little deeper. She gave him a look that said, "I thought I kind of understood before, but now I really don't." Again he smiled reassuringly, but she didn't look reassured. Reluctantly he let go, and again held up his hands to show no harm. He leaned closer, and she glanced from his eyes to the knife and then back to his eyes. He picked up the tool, showed it to her, and nodded at her ear. She shook her head and tried to take the tool. He shook his head and pointed to himself, then to her. She started to shake her head, but then stopped and sighed her acceptance. He reached up and touched the side of his head, running his fingers through his hair. He wasn't sure why, but as he reached over to her, he closed his eyes. At his touch, her head moved, but not away. He waited a moment, then gently he pushed her hair back as he held his hand around her ear. But then he stopped moving, and he opened his eyes and saw that she had cupped her hand around his hand, around her ear. He wiggled his hand under hers so that she would let go. She took her hand away, but as soon as he touched the tool to her ear, she grabbed at his hand again. He took her hand and he placed it, with the other hand, on the hilt of the knife. Before she could change her mind, he gently slipped the tip of the tool in her ear, and then he pulled it back out. Pinching the item, he smoothed her hair back, then repeated the same steps with her other ear. Finished, he sat back and looked at her. At some point she had squeezed her eyes shut, clenching her muscles to keep them shut. He added the second item to the first item he had pinched in his hand, and then leaned toward her, speaking softly. He asked, "Can you hear me now?" Her eyes opened wide, and she started fast blinking as she attempted to refocus them and clear the fuzzy noises from her head. Some birds twittered just outside of the window. Her body jumped, both hands dropped the knife as she twisted around to look up at the window. He sat back and chuckled, saying, "I'll take that as a yes." She turned back to him, nodding her head, but rubbing her jaw and wiggling it back and forth as she was trying to speak. "Good, and you should be able to speak soon as well," he said. She started rubbing her ears while opening and closing her mouth and massaging her jaw and throat muscles. He held his hand out to her, to show her what was sitting in his palm, in his hand. "Ew!" she cried, with absolutely no surprise, only disgust in her voice, and then added with a criticizing face that almost looked like it was going to throw up, "What are those?" He chuckled again, then answered, "They're called wrathworms." She stared at the little fat squiggly things. "Why, are they angry?" she asked. "Nah, they were named after the guy that found them. According to him, he was the skipper on a sailing tour that got caught up in a horrendous storm. He claimed the storm lasted a century, but it was actually only 3 hours." As Set spoke, he rolled them around with his fingers. He woke up on a small uninhabited island, which he named the Undiscovered Country. Well, while he was searching for shelter and backtracking through the woods, he found these. When he was rescued, he brought them back with him. "But why? They're dangerous," she asked with concern. "Nah, they're fun," he said, shrugging. She shook her head, replying, "No, they're not." He rolled them around and said, "Here, I'll show you. Also, I think they might look a little different in your world, maybe more like this." He blew on them, and they sprouted wings, and then began to glow. Her eyes lit up, and Set smiled and continued, "They're called lightning bugs." She looked up and asked, "Oh, so his name was Lightning?" He tilted his head and answered, "No, his name was Con. Rathcon, but wrathworms change into lightning bugs. At least that is what you know them as in your world." Holding up his hand, he blew on them again. Their tail ends lit up like beacons towards each other. Then they took to flight and flew out the window. "I think I've read about those," she said, looking away. "But there were no pictures, and I never, ever read anything about them going slumber partying in someone's ear." "So you've never seen them?" he asked, somewhat puzzled. Then added, "How long have you lived here, in this world?" She shrugged, answering, "Most of my life." Then she asked him, "Why did you put those in my ears?" "Whoa, whoa, 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 whoa. I did not put them in your ears," he replied. She frowned. "Well, if not you, then whom, and why?" she asked, sliding away from him toward the opposite end of the bed. Warily. He turned himself around and sat cross-legged, putting his arm around behind his head, and leaned back against the pillows, as he responded, "A group called the Bruisers. They were probably just out looking for some fun. Now, usually they're not so rough, but I guess they felt they had a score to settle with you, so they stuck you in a bag, which I took from them, and then I brought you in here because I couldn't release you out there, or you just would have ended up in another bag. Plus, I really wasn't sure what they had done to you, and since you were acting a little crazy, I figured that I should bring you in here." He nodded at the bag sitting on the table as he continued, "When I got you out of the bag, or more like you got yourself out, that's when I figured out they had used wrathworms." He sighed, then continued, "I tried to get them out, but again, you were a little too crazy to be sticking a sharp metal instrument in your ear. I was going to sedate you just enough to get them out, but instead you bashed me in the head several times, and then you drugged both of us and put both of us to sleep." "Oh," she said, then paused and continued with a shrug, "Well, you're a champion, and I'm a challenger, which makes us enemies. So I thought you were trying to drug me." He looked confused. "For what? Why would I drug you, or even need to?" he asked. She shrugged, answering, "Maybe you felt threatened, or wanted to take advantage of me." He looked incredulous. "Take advantage of you?" He chuckled, as he continued, "Oh, I wouldn't need a drug for that, and also, you're not my type. Your face is the opposite of desirable, and also, I prefer the furry type, and you have no fur." She cut in just as he finished. "Oh, I can see your type," she said, nodding at the furry tails around his throat. He nodded in agreement, saying, "See? To me, you're just not pretty. To a lot of people, you're just ugly. I mean, good grief, you might as well wear that bag on your head." He nodded his head at the bag on the table. She was staring at him with a blank and unreadable face, so he continued, "Oh, and I don't fear anything, including, especially, weak underlings." That got a rise out of her. He noticed as her eyes narrowed at him. Taking a deep breath and moving quickly, she slid off the bed and stood up. He made no attempt to stop her. Walking up to the table, she picked up the bag. "Is this potato sack the—" she started to ask, but he nodded his head and yawned as an answer, leaning further back against his pillows, one arm behind his head, the other covering his yawn. "Well, I want to thank you for interceding on my behalf," she said, nodding to him, then turned to leave, but looked back at him and asked, "Do you know what score these Bruisers people needed to settle with me?" He smiled, then shrugged as he answered, "Well, yeah. You tried to steal their boss's song." She shook her head, saying, "I didn't steal it. It's mine. They play—" She paused and looked at him with a puzzled look, and then took a sharp breath. She said, "Which means they work for you. You're their boss." He smiled slowly as she pieced it together, and then he nodded yes. But he also had a feeling he'd better clarify. Chuckling, he said, boss is just part of my title, so actually I'm boss to everyone, but yes, the Bruisers do work for me." Her eyes narrowed more, but he continued before she could speak. "And before you even ask, no, I did not order the attack on you, nor will there be any further attacks. At least not from any of my guys." She nodded her thanks, then asked, "So then I should be on the lookout for others to attack me?" He shrugged, replying, "It's possible. Your thievery did rub some people the wrong way." She took a deep breath, slowly saying, "I did not steal it. They played it for me, which means they gave it to me, and so it is mine." She walked to the door, looked over her shoulder, and called back to him, saying, "Again, I thank you, and good day to you, sir." She finished with a nod as she reached for the doorknob, which she tried, but it did not open. She sighed and quietly mumbled to the door, "No wonder he let me out of the bed." She had said it quietly, but she heard him chuckle from behind her. Taking a deep breath then, and letting it out, she looked over her shoulder at him. He was leaning forward, resting his chin against his thumb, with his fingers covering his mouth. She squinted at him. She couldn't help it but feel that that pose reminded her of someone. Somehow. And he couldn't help but smile as he slowly pulled the key from his pocket. She turned and moved toward him, but he flipped the key down into his closed fist. "Open the door," she said calmly, standing in place. He looked up as if he was thinking. She interrupted, saying, "Please, Mr. Boss Person, will you open the door?" she asked, keeping her voice cool and even, though her cheeks were starting to warm. Closing one eye, he shook his head, "No." Hands on her hips, she said, "Oh, Set, come on. I don't have time for games. I have much to prepare still." He looked at her curiously, so rolling her eyes, she corrected herself and said, "Oh, excuse me, boss guy or Mr. the Boss or whatever they call you. But if you want something, please tell me what it is so we can get on with this." He leaned forward, tapped the bed in front of him, and then sat back against his pillows. She looked suspiciously at him and asked, "Why do you want me back in your bed? I thought I wasn't your type." He shook his head, replying, "You're not, but I do have a proposition for you." She stared at him. He stared back. Exhaling, she walked over and started to sit on the appointed spot, but looking at him pointedly, she sat down on the spot next to the spot where he had pointed to, so a spot further away from him. His hand was hiding his mouth, but not enough to hide his smile. She gave him an annoyed look. Again, Jen was reminded of someone else from the way Set spoke from behind his hand. "What do you have to prepare for?" he asked. "The same as everyone else here," she replied, giving him a dull look. "No, why are you here? No, wait, let me rephrase that. "Why are you really here?" he asked. She smiled. "Well, I'm the new makeup artist for the champions, and I'm thinking that Mr. the Boss, we're going to need a lot of rouge to cover that blush of yours." She chuckled, and although quietly, he did too. Shaking her head, she added, "I'm a fighter. I'm here to fight." There was a sound from outside the window of an animal calling out the hour. She tilted her head toward it, but he drew her attention back by using his hands to indicate her unseen frailty. "With what?" "Your kind are—" he started to say, but she cut him off, saying, "I know, weak, uneducated, and oh, so ugly. Don't worry, I promise I will never forget your opinions. In fact, thank you for them, because I'm going to use them as fuel to beat you." She finished with a smile. He chuckled and replied, "I'm one of the last ones. You really think you're going to get that far? And last night, if I remember correctly, you were losing that fight with me." She pulled her cloak out of the sack that had gotten balled up inside. "I wasn't losing. I was maintaining my defensive position," she answered. "Oh, then why didn't you break free of me?" he asked. She stood up and pulled her cloak around her, fastening the bag to the inside, then looked at him. "I was just gauging my opponent, Mr. Boss, that's all I was doing. But trust me, we haven't fought yet." Shrugging, she added, "So if there's nothing more, if you please, the door, or just hand me the key," she said, nodding at the door, then putting her hand out. He glanced at her hand and then up at her, answering, "But there is something more I haven't told you about my proposition yet." She tilted her head and impatiently tapped her wrist at him. He had no clue what she meant by that, but he figured it was a show of impatience, like tapping one's foot. So he continued, saying, "Think of it like a compromise. Also, you need more than just a key to unlock that door. You need me." So as I was saying, he started, but she cut him off, saying, "How about you continue your 'so as you were saying' while you walk to the door? Now that's a compromise I can get behind," she said, joking, but still hopeful. He rolled his eyes, but then moved to get up. She backed up to allow him room. He stood up, but didn't move forward. "So my compromise," he started to say, as she nodded her head toward the door, urging him on. I'll get there," he said, shushing her urgent nodding, with a wave of his hand. She rolled her eyes as he repeated himself. But the time was already so late, so she decided to help him out. "So as I was saying," he started again, as she grabbed his arm and pulled him toward her, but angled him toward the door. He gave her an odd look when she started controlling his arm, but then, ignoring that she was taking liberties with his arm, he freely walked along until he freely decided to stop. When he abruptly stopped, he looked back at her with a look of surprise, saying, "Oh, you're not in a hurry, are you?" She fumed a little, answering, "Set, you know very well that I am." He raised an eyebrow at her. She stammered and corrected. "I mean boss person," she said, rolling her eyes. He nodded his head, accepting the correction, then continued, "What could you possibly have to do that takes up that much time?" Shaking her head, she walked around him, shoved the table against him, and started pushing him with it. With the initial shove, she got one step out of him, but nothing after that. He looked back over his shoulder at her and asked, why are you using a table?" She gritted her teeth with exertion and responded, "I saw your look earlier, and I didn't want you to think I was trying to touch you or being funny in some way." He chuckled deeply and smiled as he replied, "Oh, but you are. And the reason for the table is so that you don't have to touch me?" She had not stopped pushing when she responded, "Right. And this move," he said as he indicated the table behind him, "this attempt again begs the question, how do you expect to beat, well, not just me, but any one?" She had stopped pushing and answered him, "Have you ever heard of David and Goliath?" "No. Should I?" he asked, smiling as he used her line against her. She didn't notice as she replied, "Oh, well, he was probably a champion before your time, but he was a weak, puny little guy with no magic skills. Just some common sense, and nobody thought he could bring down his mighty foe, but he did. She reached behind her to grab the sheet off the bed, figuring on a plan that involved the sheet plus table equaling the mighty will have fallen, and if angled right, will have fallen right next to the door. But just as she reached behind her, the table went sideways to the other side of the room. Set calmly backed up a few feet, the length of the table, and stood in front of her. Facing forward with a big grin, he softly said, "Now push." She looked at the table, then at him, well, at his back. She weighed her options, figuring he still wasn't going to move, but he was going to make fun, she would make fun back. She put her hand up, but instead of shoving him forward, she simply tapped on his arm. She was already starting to say, "Oh, gee, look, it didn't," when it did. Set moved one foot forward. She scoffed behind him, and he looked over his shoulder at her, grinning, and said with a shrug, "I'm a sucker for that skin-to-skin contact." Annoyed, she shook her head at him, then tapped his arm again. He moved the other foot forward. Exhaling loudly from behind him, she started fast-tapping the back of his arm, and he started moving foot by foot toward the door. Well, more like each foot was half a foot, because he was only shuffling forward, but he was still going forward. Suddenly, he stopped. She tapped his arm again, thinking that maybe one of them was off their count, but he still did not move. "Set!" she cried, her cheeks warm and getting warmer. He tilted his head as if he was going to look back at her, but didn't. He stood and waited patiently. Fuming loudly, she put her shoulder to his back and shoved. His torso leaned forward momentarily, but his feet did not move. "Oh, why do I have to be so afraid of heights?" she said, through gritted teeth, as she shoved, moving him about as much as one could if they were pushing a beyond their strength level boulder. But then the boulder moved. Of course, it was only half of a foot from before, but it was still something. He chuckled as he shuffled forward, and continued to chuckle. Her voice, coming from behind him, sounded slightly strained as she asked, "Really, Set, why are you doing this?" He looked over his shoulder at her and said, "Oh, no biggie. I'm just gauging my opponent." And he kept looking at her annoyed face as he finished the last few steps to the door, without her pushing him. She shook her head, walked around him to the door, and looked at him expectantly. He stared back as he reached into his pocket, his expression changing to shock as he pulled his hand out. Empty. "I seem to have misplaced the key," he said, dismayed. She rolled her eyes, responding. "You are such a time-waster," she sighed, and added, "In your pocket?" "Nope, but you're welcome to check. I mean, that is, if you want the key," he said, smiling at her. She fumed as she stared at him, and icily replied, "I'm not reaching my hand in your pocket, Set, but I will cut it off to get the key." His eyes grew wide. "Well, luckily there's no need for that, since it's probably on the bed," he said, smiling, and nodding his head at the bed. She crossed her arms, saying, "You're stalling, Set. Now get the key out of your pocket." "No, the key you need is on the bed," he replied. "No, it's not," she started to say, but he was already walking back over to the bed. He picked up something on the bed. Her eyes narrowed, and she shook her head at him when he held the key up. She was still shaking her head when he walked back. "This is," he started to say, but she snatched the key from him and turned for the door. Then he slid in between her and the door, blocking her from the keyhole. She sighed and shook her head, but then started nodding instead, saying, "Actually, you know what? I agree. You are the boss." He raised his eyebrows with mild surprise, appreciating her statement. "At procrastinating," she finished, and he nodded his head, and then he started up again, saying, "So as I was saying." He paused to see her reaction. She crossed her arms and waited for him to continue. "You like my intro song," he said. "Yes, I do. I do like my intro song," she agreed. He squinted his eyes at her and continued, "Well, the audience loves a show, so let's give 'em one." Her head tilted curiously. "We?" she asked. He nodded. "Yeah, we. We will split the arena, your show on one side and mine on the other. Then we shall see which one of us the audience finds more entertaining." He watched her press her lips together as she looked away thinking. He leaned over and caught her attention, adding, "Just think. No one would hassle you any further about it. Or hassle you at all." He noticed the interest in her eyes. They changed a little as she asked in a hesitant voice, "So what do I get out of all this? So what do you get out of all of this?" He shrugged and replied, "I own some interest in this place, so anything that adds publicity and interest also adds to my pocket." She nodded, slowly. "Okay, when?" she asked him. He tilted his head and answered with a shrug. "When they do my intro? Well, now, our intro." She nodded, saying, "Okay, agreed." Then suddenly the light dawned in her eyes and she gasped, "Wait! You're one of the champions that they're announcing today!" The alarm continuing in her voice as she worried her head back and forth. "Oh, but I don't have anything prepared." He had already unlocked the door from behind his back and was starting to move out of her way. But then he stopped and asked, "What's with you and always having to be prepared? Were you a wolf scout?" Confused, she looked at him and shook her head, then tried to move past him. Just as she had a clear path through the door, and she was heading through it, he put his arm in her way. She stopped right before smacking into his arm and whispered in annoyance, "Set!" As she tilted her head back to look at him, "I really have to go," she added. He nodded and said, "You are." She rolled her head around to him to look at him sideways and replied, "Oh, really? 'Cause from here it looks like you're still in the way." He dropped his voice down. "You have what you need to be safe now," he said softly as he lifted his arm. She turned herself around and faced him as she slowly backed out of the room. She had no clue what he was talking about, and she wasn't waiting around for him to stall more. "Right," she said, her voice trailing off. She pulled her hood up, her green eyes sparkling from its depths as she smiled, then crossed her hands in front of her throat, around her throat, as she mimicked like a throat piece, like what tailed him. "And I'm sure that's what you said to her, too. And I'm sure her door is always open, too." Without waiting for a reply, she took off. He watched the cloak as it floated down the near deserted hallway, then turning the corner, it disappeared. And then next chapter. Sorry, for some reason the computer screwed up my chapter numbers. I'm not really sure why. And I have a little highlighted section here that I'm just going to go ahead and read. It's probably one of those things that I needed to fix grammatically but didn't. She had a feeling she knew why he had kept her so long. Same reason he kept asking her why she had to prepare so much. "Well, because unlike you, Mr. The Boss, I have no talents or skills, and if less time to prepare things." She walked out onto the battlefield, less prepared. "'Tis sabotage you're after, Mr. Boss, but according to you, you do not fear me, so then why the sabotage?" "Ah, perhaps you do fear me." She realized she was still holding the key in her hand, and she shoved in her cloak pocket with a mental note to return it later. ... But had she really thought about it, she didn't unlock the door, but had the key. That was the highlighted section. And yes, it was grammatically wrong. I kind of skipped over it. Anyway, she took off like a shot, running down the hall that was deserted except for some guy. Shaking his head, Set chuckled at the guy, snoring in Foxy's doorway, then headed back into his own room, not bothering to lock it. Tired, he laid down, but he couldn't sleep, so he stared at the ceiling. It was a shame and a waste. Maybe she could win against a couple of those other challengers. And who knows, maybe all of them, but not a champion. How could he stop her from fighting? Maybe tonight he'll just take her out himself. Out of the tournament, keeping her drugged during the tournament, might be her only chance of survival. It would only be for a few days, so he could just keep her in the closet. Frustrated that he still couldn't sleep, he threw the blanket off and headed to the shower. When he came back, he sensed something and sniffed the air. Still stripped naked from his shower, he started digging through the bedclothes. He put the knife aside that had been wrapped up in them, and then he found what he had been looking for, the stain. Yanking the sheet off and tearing it, he breathed it in deeply, sighing a deep growl. It was her scent, and also the same scent from when she had showered under the cliff, and that perfume scent was all over his sheets. He smelled all around the sheets, his knuckles vibrating and his fists tightened while he slowly hunted for the stain. It incensed him. Breathing it deeply, it also centered him. He felt alert and alive. "Yeah, it'll be a shame when someone draws this out of you," he said huskily. He took one last sniff, then threw it on the bed and headed to the shower, saying as he went, and spilling it all over the arena floor. Chapter number not sure. Grandma. "Oh, dargone it and dagnabbit," her muffled voice said as she searched through all the nooks and crannies of her tree. She knew she had an extra knife, but where? Where? Oh, there you are! Her grunts were muffled as she pulled the knife and herself free of the large hole in the tree. She caught her breath and looked around. Because of her rock and water trick, the ground had become mushy all around the base of the tree, and now she was standing, well, sinking in it, and some places were very slick from the mud. She looked down and wiped the mud from her leg. Whomever it was that had cut her last night had left a sizable gash in her leg. Sighing, she finished the last of her breakfast of self-made jerky, then set to work, cleaning her wound. It was unsightly, and she really hoped it would heal quickly, but knew it wouldn't. Not that it mattered. She was ugly anyway. She was different, very plain, very weak, compared to the exotic and well-abled creatures around here. Some had piercing eyes that lit up, and some had dark, smoldering, seductive eyes that drew you in and did not let go. They were captivating and quite beautiful, especially when they painted their faces. It made them glow and look alive. Add that to their furriness, and, well, Jen had to admit she felt a little intimidated. Their fur made them seem healthy, important, and robust. When they walked into rooms, they walked in as strong women with powers, whereas Jen was thin, scrawny, and her oversized cloak hung about her spindly arms and weak shoulders. She had no power and no fur. Well, actually, she did have fur, just not like theirs. The hair on her arms didn't grow much, but the hair on her legs and other places grew quite a bit. Back when she slept on the floor and it was cold out, she'd let her hair grow out, but in the hot days she would use a gritty stone and wipe away her hair. She had to admit she liked the smooth feeling, and when she left home she kept herself smooth, and it also helped because her cloak didn't get caught on her legs since her fur was sharp and sparse, not soft. Now she was wondering if maybe not smooth could be okay too. Sure, there were other smooth women like her, but the interesting ones, they had soft fur and even softer tails. She shook her head of the thoughts, gathered her supplies, and climbed to the top of the hill so she could sit and hopefully come up with a plan for today's show. Since she had already worn her cloak during her first announcement, she knew she couldn't get away with it again. The audience would want to see what she looked like. The thought made her nervous because then he would see her face, and that would confirm where she was, and that scared her. Of course, she wouldn't be wearing a cloak while fighting, so now was as good a time as any to get used to not having it. Just remember, she reminded herself, you're strong and you got away from there once. You can do it again. She shivered, then got back to thinking. She knew whatever she came up with, it had to be something she could cook up quickly, since she wouldn't have time to stew anything. Plus, she still had other fights to prepare for, and that takes time as well. Most of her concoctions could gel overnight, but some needed a couple days. But now she had to put all that on hold, all because the boss had proclaimed that he would share the floor with a common her. She scoffed, saying "the boss," then added more like pompous windbag. But her mind was flashing images of the bed, his bed, and being trapped by his black boots, which somehow seemed to speak for themselves. She shook her head, confused. No, 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 no. They weren't black. Or were they? And they didn't trap me. Or did they? Suddenly and oddly, her terrible experience of her uncertain doom whilst in the bag was now changing. The bag calmly swayed because he was carrying her instead of the bruisers. The hot oven air was now replaced by his warm breath as he spoke to her, and again she shook her head as she reminded herself and said out loud, "No, he's a jerk, a jerk, a jerk. He kept me in a bag, and who knows what he was actually saying. In fact, I'll bet they weren't nice words at all. That procrastinator stalled so I wouldn't be able to prepare correctly, so that I would fail. He only kept me there because, well, what would he have done with the body, you know? The rules clearly state that no one is allowed to kill anyone unless it's during battle on the field. Otherwise, the offending party will be punished with imprisonment, or worse, they will be disqualified. So again, I ask, what would he have done with my body? Well, I guess he could have hidden my dead body in his closet, but truly, there wouldn't have been enough room, what with all the other skeletons already hanging in there. Ugh, stupid jerk, she said, trying to clear her mind by taking some already mixed ingredients and mixing them more. Besides, he likes furry creatures, the ones with tails, which, actually, now that I think of it, that would have been nice to have back when I was sleeping on that stone floor. Thinking of the cold floor again reminded her of a warm wall, or what she had thought was a warm oven wall. A tear slid down her cheek as she whispered, "I was warm. I've never been warm like that before." Last night she had been so busy thinking of how to escape or how to get away that she hadn't stopped to realize how much she would have wanted to... A voice interrupted her. "Oh, there you are, my little bird." Jen's thoughts were interrupted by a kindly old lady coming up the hill. "Oh, my, am I interrupting anything?" she asked as she reached the top. Her stooped body was covered in different colored robes that splashed all over her. The youth stammered as she stood up, all while trying to remember the proper greeting for her aged visitor. But she could only remember one story with mice and pumpkins. But the elder woman wasn't a fairy, so the youth extended her hand and replied, "Good morning, grandmother." Noticing her messy hands, the youth hastily wiped the ingredients from her hands just before the elder woman's shaky hand accepted hers. "Ooh, grandmother, yes, I like that," the grandmother said, strongly shaking the youth's hand while she smiled up at her, looking into her eyes. The grandmother's eyes twinkled as if there was an eye inside of her eye, and it was winking. "Oh, good," responded the youth, whom was glad she had picked the proper way to address the elder woman. "Well, I am," she started to say, but the grandmother spoke over her. "Oh, I already know who you are. You're a champion, and oh, I've heard many stories about you." The youth smiled and shook her head, then attempted to correct her. "No, grandmother, I'm afraid you are mistaken. I'm just a challenger, and nothing has happened yet that would create stories that could be—" But again the grandmother spoke louder. "Oh, no, you're a champion, no hiding that from an old woman," she finished with a big grin while wagging a crooked and knobby old finger at her. The youth smiled back and did not argue. She had read about a girl whom had been disrespectful, throwing out words like sharp thorns at a poor elder. Well, suffice to say that girl got what was coming to her. So, since the youth did not want to end up like a spinning wheel, she smiled. "I do have something important to prove," she said. "I am trying to—" But the youth stopped speaking when she felt the old lady squeeze her hand, and then she saw the old lady's eyes twinkle as she said, "Your sadness isn't real, child, but it is understood." Then she gestured, and the youth's gaze followed. "That tree is a fruit tree, but it bears no fruit, and so no fruit exists. And that is its sadness." Then quick as a whip, grandmother changed her somber tune and pointed at some jars on the ground. "Oh, might I have a pinch of that?" she asked cheerfully. The youth, whom was still staring at the tree and trying to figure out the old woman's meaning or wisdom, all the while captivated by its low-hanging branches, dreamily responded, "Yes, grandmother," her voice trailing off until she realized that the old woman was staring at her. Her reverie broken, she blinked and turned to fetch one of the jars on the ground, but she didn't know what she wanted. "What would you like?" she asked, kneeling down next to the jars while attempting to break hand contact from from the old woman, so that she could pick up the jars, but the old lady held firmly to the youth's hand, so the youth looked up at her. The grandmother chuckled softly and said, "They did not choose poorly." Then, becoming jovial again, she let go of the youth's hand and pointed at one of the jars. "Oh, that one," she chirped. "Okay, let me get you something to put it in," the youth said, starting to stand up with a pinch of it in her hand. "Oh, I'm fine without it," the old lady said as she showed the youth that she already had a pinch of it in her hand. The youth shook her head. "But how did you—" Her voice trailed off as she looked at her own empty hand. The old woman waved her off, saying, "Oh, I'm faster than I look. I used to fire dance, and you gotta be quick when you do that. I used to make men burn and crowds go wild." Then, cupping her hair in a very feminine way, she added, "You know, back in my younger days." She turned to leave, but then turned back and said, "Oh, here, this is for you," she said, winking, as she handed the youth a small bag. "Makes anything you make cook, heal, or burn just a little faster, just a little stronger. Kind of like an accelerator pedal." Then the old lady knelt down and pulled the youth's bandages loose. "And use some on your leg, but remember, a little goes a long way," she said, unwrapping the bandages while strongly holding the youth in place. The youth smiled down at her and wondered if it would be safe, or if it would work on some of her future mixes. "It won't harm a thing," she said. A thing that it is used on, and it'll work on any mixture," the old lady added as she inspected the wound. The youth shook her head, wondering, how did she— But then she remembered her manners and said, "Thank you, grandmother, but please do not waste this on me. It's just a little cut." The old lady looked up at the youth, her winking eye twinkling, and then she looked back to where she was applying the ointment and said, "But it is content for the fruit to bear under—" The old woman seemed to still be speaking, but then her voice changed to struggling and grunting as she stood up and finished her sentence, saying, "Stand?" She smiled at the youth. The youth blinked and then looked at her leg and said, "I think so. But how can I repay you?" The old lady smiled. "You already have." "I did?" the confused youth asked. The old woman beamed and replied, "You called me grandmother, which is not only more fitting for an old lady like me, but I also like it." The youth still looked confused, so the old lady explained softly, "You gave me a name." Then, glancing down at the ground behind them, nodded her head as she said, "Oh, my dear, I think you have a little spill," she said, nodding her head. The youth looked over and saw that one of the undisturbed jars furthest from them had somehow tipped over and spilled its contents. She kneeled down and began cleaning up the mess. As soon as her knees hit the ground, she looked back up to thank the old lady, but she was gone. Standing up, she looked around and spotted her. "Wow, she sure is a fast little bugger, and she must have been a fast—" Her voice trailed off as she watched the old woman head toward town. She sat down and used the contents of the smaller jar from the bag, marked "Neospores," on a little cut on her arm. She looked at the other jar, the bigger jar marked "Speedy" in big letters, and under it in tiny letters it said, like mouse, ... JK. Curious," she said, wrapping a bandage around her arm. Off in the distance she saw light reflecting off a pond. "Like a mouse," she added, her mind thinking again, thinking about that night's task. A little later, thanks to grandmother, she had a plan, and now she was set to work, right after a quick trip to the pond. Well, not quick trip, but you can't milk time. But then another little later on, she was back at the arena and talking to Benny, one of the arena keepers. He showed her where she could find some old mismatched armor pieces and chainmail. "It won't protect you very well," he said with concern. She smiled, answering, "That's okay. I won't need it to protect me." Then she and Benny rerouted some of the piping around and under the arena, and after messing with the triggering below, they cleared a hole where a spike could shoot up out of the ground, but not completely out, just up, and hopefully it would hold in place. Then, after she gave him a sequence and a timing sheet and thanked him for his help, she ran off to get ready. While running down one of the hallways, she tripped and her robe went up, showing up to her thigh.
She heard a whistle from behind her. "Yeah, show us some skin," a group of young gawkers yelled. She got up and dusted herself off, thankful her hood had stayed up. Then she took off and didn't look back. Boys, she thought to herself, and they never grow out of it. She ran, carefully, back to the old armory that Benny had shown her earlier. There was a closet where she could get the last few needed ingredients. Then she found a nice quiet corner by some open windows and began working. She spread everything thickly but evenly. She primed and painted her equipment, and then put it in a sunny spot to dry. She used a reflective shield to apply her paint. It was funny, because the image was distorted and wavy, but not fun because it was on her face. She could only hope that she had done it correctly and that it was sweat-resistant. She needed to test that possibility, and since there was a nice sunny spot and she had nothing more to do, she took a nap and dreamed about a spooky thing that hides in your closet and comes out to get you.
Okay, so this next chapter, it's a little tricky. It's not completely finished, so I'm just going to kind of run through it. I'm actually going to read the rough draft of it, the pencil scratched in a notebook rough draft. There's some things missing, but yeah, unfortunately I can't work on it right now. It's a brain block, we'll say. Not writer's block, not at all. Something else. Anyway, won't go into all that. So just bear with me, as I'm going to read a little bit from the computer where I've made things a little nicer. Still a rough draft. And then I'm, like I said, the pencil scratching. This is the whole reason for this story, believe it or not. Let's see here. Okay, so here goes. He had learned early how to negotiate without negotiating. He smiled. He never actually said she could win the song. Not that she could hold the audience attention anyway. He was totally rested, freshly showered, again, and now ready to make his entrance. He looked out the champion's door and out the arena floor. Earlier, he had given Benny the heads up so that he and his team were to leave half of the arena open, and it looked like they had done just that. The arena floor, which would normally be filled with the debris everywhere, was now split in half, leaving debris all over one half and the other half completely empty. Well, no, he could see what appeared to be a black cloak laying on the ground. He chuckled, figuring someone in the crowd was not too happy they had lost that. He stretched his neck and walked out. The crowd cheered, but they also looked confused. He waved at some girls who were practically falling over the railing and begging to meet him. He raised two hands at the entire cheering crowd, quieting them. Then he called out, "So usually I've got entrance music. And you feel like something's missing, right?" The crowd cheered, yeah. He walked over to a corner and stepped up to some of the debris, leaned sideways toward the audience and tapped his ear, then called out, "Perhaps a little catch in your ear that you're not hearing?" He put up his leg on some of the debris, his words addressing a specific audience. "To be honest, without it, I feel a little naked." There was a collective of different words being yelled by the crowd, but every word meant they were catching on to what he was throwing. Jumping down, he ran to another corner of his half-pit. He spun around with a flourish. It reminded him of being back home in the pit, and how good it felt to warm up the crowd. "Well, you're still going to get it," he called out, in a warning and menacing tone. Several girls were now begging and falling over the railing. The crowd cheered, but he started talking before they could beg for more. "As you know, a challenger tried to steal my song." The crowd interrupted him, booing at the non-present challenger. Set nodded his head in agreement, then gathered their attention again. "Now, as I understand it was an accident," he said. The crowd booed. "But I'm a fair guy." He got whistles from the crowd. "So I'm going to walk out and come back in, and when the music plays, Then myself and the challenger," he said as he pointed over to where just a black sheet was thrown on the ground. "Wherever she is," he continued, "we'll walk out at the same time." The crowd laughed. He even heard some say the boss scared her and she ran away. Set got back into his showman stance and called out, "Well, we're going to put on a show. And let's see who can entertain you more." The crowd went wild as he made his way back to the champion's doorway. All lights went dark, except for the reflection of the dying sun on the arena's walls. While waiting for his cue, he stretched a few times and thought about what he had planned. It was his usual show of might and muscle. His side was set up with large debris, makeshift towers, and any other obstacle his crew could find for him to smash, attack, and pound his way through as he showed off his moves. Yeah, he liked keeping things simple, changing things up every once in a while to keep them on their feet and filling every seat. But not that simple, he thought, looking at her side, which was barren except for the black cloak heaped in the middle, lying in the dirt. Maybe she really had just run away, he thought. He remembered those determined hunting eyes and shook his head. Nah, she's stronger than that, he said under his breath. He had his cue, and he ran out into the dark before the music started, to make his first smash. He made sure that the audience always heard him before they saw him. But this time he was curious to see if he was right or wrong, so instead of stopping at the first bit of debris, he one hand flipped over it and ran over to smash a large piece between his side and hers. The sound shook the arena, just as the music began and dim flickering lights lit up his side. The audience saw the explosion as now bits of debris littered the arena floor. He tossed a large boulder up into the air, and just as it came down, he straight fist pounded it, shattering the whole rock into a shower of tiny pebbles. It was through that shower that Set saw the black material move. It moved as if it was caught up by a delicate wind, swaying to the music as it floated upwards. The sheet rose up from the ground, revealing its pale, shapely legs. "Sheets don't have legs," he said under his breath, as he realized it wasn't a sheet. It was a sack, like the brown sack that he had taken her out of the night before, only now it was black and moving, like he had never seen a sack move before. The irony of how she had fought to get out of it, and now, of her own volition, she was back in it. He watched as black-covered fingers, then hands, twisted and waved out of the bottom corners of the sack, a sack with no head. Then the sack reared itself backward, sticking its shapely legs behind itself out, as a few flames roared up from behind the ground, the flames licking the sack's backside as it did a full arc movement through the heat. The move reminded his mesmerized mind of a black moon's smiley face smile. The sack stood up and raised its black hands skyward, as fire exploded from the ground, encircling the sack and trapping it within its burning walls. Just as some black-covered thing emerged from the sack's shoulders and rolled up, giving the sack a covered head, revealing a covered head. More of that material was gathered up and twisted through the mangled hair tie. It reminded Set of the scary stories the wolf scoots would tell around a fire, in particular the creature that hides under your bed or in your closet. It gave you oogie kind of feelings. The fire disappeared, allowing only the dim lights of random small fires, igniting here and there away from the main event to illuminate the sack's movements. A bag was dancing seductively, even though its backside had burned. The bag had not torn away. Instead, it was a dim glowing red lines that could be seen. He was puzzled as he continued to watch the dancing bag. Its middle was undulating and swaying to the music. Its hips swayed to the music. The bag's movements had somehow twisted the material, giving its arm form. The bag leaned sideways, dipping its body down as it reached that arm into flames that had suddenly appeared. Then it twisted its other, now formed arm another way around as its body leaned the opposite direction, lighting that arm. And with a change in movement, it then slid its hip into the flames. Always
protected by that bag. Rising back up, never missing a beat, the bag continued its dance, twisting itself in an almost torturous way, as everywhere the fire had licked, red glowing veins began appearing. He saw a glint of metal shoot up from the ground behind the bag. A red-veined black hand grabbed around the top of the thick metal spear, while a pale leg lifted up into the air, stretched out, and then wrapped itself around the spear. At the same time that the leg was wrapping around the spear, the bag leaned its head down into some flames, stirring it around in the fire and searing the red veins into its gathered material on top. The bag lifted its head out of the flames and circled its head around, as the bag laid back, supported only by one leg. Still holding onto the spear, the still burning embers had created red lines in the air as it swung its head around within seconds. The lines had disappeared. Laying back, the bag bent its supporting leg and dipped its body down. More flames appeared, as if silently commanded, and the bag dipped, first its hair, then it rolled its back and hips into the flames. As the music changed, the bag stood, its leg releasing the spear, and then still holding its leg up, the bag pivoted, spinning its whole body around until it landed down on its haunches, both feet on the ground. Fire ripped up in front of the bag as the bag began weaving back and forth. The fire was all around it, and then it started to die down. The bag dropped its masked face and chest into the flames licking its face and mask, licking back, both of them rising slowly in a torturous dance, embering material, burning into ash. Still that bag protected the body from within, from those flames. As the bag rose above the flames flickering like they were losing fuel, and they died down. The bag's hands tore like claws across its chest, shredding the material, the red-veined material, and revealing the bare flesh beneath. Set was reminded of a big hulking guy who used to fight in his pits. He had this habit of tearing his shirts open before every fight. He didn't last long. All the pointless massacring always left him a little green in the face. Watching what he was seeing now, Set had to admit he didn't care for the shirt-ripping habit, but what he was seeing now he didn't mind the habit so much. The bag was still swaying, but now its body was writhing and twisting, while its head spun around, its enthusiastic dance causing more and more glowing pieces to darken as they dropped to the ground. As it stood tall, one arm shot up in the air, the other dragged at the loose material on its hip, tearing at it, revealing so much more, just as the light began to fade. The bag's head began rotating, dangerously, all the fires around them dying to whispers of warmth. Then suddenly, flames shot up from the ground, illuminating the entire pit floor, the whole arena, and all the way up her legs. The bag's structural integrity was still sound enough that it covered any possible view of entrance, but still, what a sight to see. Her dance was powerful and maddening as the flames licked the lower half of her bare thighs and beyond to where no eyes could see. Her hips rolled against the flames as if urging them to come and play. Okay, I'm going to pause here for a moment because apparently it did not fix as much as I thought I had from this version, so I'm just going to switch to the book version. So it's going to be we're going to be rewinding for a minute, but I think it's worth it because it's got a little bit different description. Anyway, here goes. Sheets don't have legs, he said under his breath as he realized it wasn't a sheet, it was a sack like the one he had taken her out of last night. The one that had been sitting on his table, that she was now back in. A moment of strong music brought flames up from the ground, circling around her. The bag was dancing seductively within the circle, and continued as the flames died down, moving its hips and swaying to the music. She leaned to one side, holding out a somewhat formed arm, still completely covered by the bag. At the same moment the music dipped, her arm dipped down into the flames that had leapt up out of nowhere, engulfing her arm. Set expected her to scream. The audience expected her to scream, but she did not. In fact, her dance seemed even brighter, as red, slow-moving embering cracks appeared all around her arm. The flames died down, and the dance continued as she leaned back and stuck one leg out behind her, the flames climbing up her leg to burn the bag above them. She rolled her hips against the flames as if urging them to come play with her in her dangerous game. She switched positions and leaned to her other side, twisting her arm in a different direction and lighting it up as well. By now the embers, slowly burning, were creating cracks in the material. Where you would expect to see burnt and red sizzling flesh, instead you saw pale skin, unmarred and unblemished, teasing through the cracks of the burning bag. A tiny glint of black metal could be seen through one of the cracks at the very tippy top of her milky thighs. That were untouched by fire and soot. Behind her a black spike shot up out of the ground. She grabbed the top of it with her now visible hand. Using the spike as a brace, she turned sideways, leaned back, and dipped low, then rolled her body, thrusting her arm and hips into the flames that were, at that moment, shooting up from the ground. She started at the top of her back, moving down as she rolled her body against the fire, all the way to the bottom of the bag. She stood back up against the spike, her body dropping down as her hand slid down the spike. Now low to the ground, supported on one leg, she swirled around, moving up as she did, just as the flames leapt out from behind her again. She swung her other leg out behind her, setting it ablaze. As she reached both arms up and crossed them, each one tugging on the other, like long opera gloves, the cracks in them tearing them off easily. She swayed to the music, her hips swinging round in circles as her body moved freely within the bag, even as the bag began to deteriorate all around her through the embering cracks. The skin of her arms, legs, hips, thighs, chest, and stomach all peeking out like trapped and unbridled moonlight. She bent low, her masked head was swaying just like her hips, but in the opposite direction. Fire shot up in front of her, and she stuck her head in it, swirling it around, the same way you might move your head under a shower of water. Then she moved her head up and down as the flames licked at her, and she licked them back. Arcing her back, she tilted her chest in as she lifted her head out. Her hair was free, the red and purple strands falling like dark streams from their burning enclosure. Her dark hair reflected the fire. The red in her hair became the flames. The purple was like a deep amethyst. Again, your expectations would be for there was still no burning smell, no melting flesh, only the smell of fire and spice. She clawed across her chest, the embering material shredding and exposing the tops of her breasts through the claw marks. She raised one hand, her other hand dropped to her hip, all while her head was spinning around and around. A morbid but beautiful pattern was embering its way across her mask. Her hips moved within the black chainmail skirt, pieces of the material still clinging here and there to larger pieces, but all were burning. The music began a marching soar, like soldiers being called to battle and titans heralded from the sea. Her body moved like a snake, intent on its own poison, with secret intent to share. Her arms moved out away from her, her hand rising within the smoke, raising the burnt offerings to the sky, her fingertips sensing and breathing in the night, vibrating within the sweet sensations of the dark. Her head spinning around, but now more dangerously, and with each pass from the flow of her hips more and more begone is the bag, now replaced with undeniable form of a woman. She continued her hypnotic frenzy of a dance, even as bits of char and ash fell like snow at her feet. The music climbed to the summit, almost met, her hips and head slowing their rotations. Her legs slid slightly to the side, and even as she held her masked head high, her hands, lower, weak and slow. Suddenly the fire rose from the ground, just as the music hit its mountainous peak. Flames shoot out from under her and up her. Her hand raised up as the flames licked up between her thighs. Her hips shook as she accepted the power of the fire surging through her, blasting her and anyone around her with an unbelievable heat. The music ended, followed by silence and darkness except for the moonlight, which she was thankful for, because the way she was positioned and her face was positioned was in the shadows. She stood there, her head down, breathing hard to herself, making herself faint, but she listened. There was no sound from the crowd. not even a boo. She fought the tears she could feel stinging her eyes, but she refused to cry. In the small time that she had been given to work, she had worked hard. She also thought she was being different, giving the crowd something unusual to watch, and she thought showing some skin was what they wanted. She sighed, inside and outside, her thoughts realizing she must have been wrong. But suddenly the crowd broke from the spell and began cheering loudly, and it hurt her ears, but she thankfully left them uncovered as she looked up and smiled, nodding. A tear escaped. She wiped it away as she heard another voice near her shoulder. She breathed in deeply and turned to face him. He stood motionless and stunned, but so was the rest of the arena. He thought he saw her peeking at him out from beneath her hair, but all he could do was smile at her. Just before the crowd began to roar. His mind was spinning with thoughts and questions, which the roar of the crowd was not helping. She looked shaken, and Set was concerned that she might run. He wanted to catch her before she disappeared, and when she had nothing immediate to prepare for, so they could have a normal conversation. It was dark in the arena. Usually the house lights came on after a performance, but Benny must have left them off for some reason. Set saw a glint of metal move, and he realized she was moving, so he followed. Inside, the tunnels were dark. It led away from the arena floor, but he kept that metal glint in sight, following it whenever it turned. Sudden bright lights invaded his eyes and mind as he entered one of the well-lit outer hallways. In contrast to the dark outside, it caused his sight to go hazy. He blinked, but it didn't go away, and it obstructed his vision. But then he caught sight of her just as she turned and headed down into one of the lower corridors. His vision still felt wrong, like he was seeing things. He tried to blink it away as he saw what looked like a mist following along the ceiling, but blinking wasn't making it go away, so he gave up trying and just continued to follow her. A moment later, he turned a corner, quickly, but a little too quickly, and caught up to her. He had never looked back, or he would have seen that the mist had started back where he had. Lightning flashed in his mind, and his voice, not his, but it echoed like thunder from somewhere else. It was his, but not his, sorry. They were not his words, but Set said them out loud. I feel your pain, but no. He slammed into her and held her hands flat against the wall. Words were in his mind, so many words. She shoved hard against him, trying to free herself from being between him and the wall, but then there was no resistance as he stumbled backwards. Turning around, she saw him, and she could feel as he grabbed at an invisible madness while uttering words. Too many words. He looked drunk or sick, but he also looked dangerous, and she couldn't take any chance of stopping to help him, so she ran away. Her footsteps, were like thunder as he crashed to the ground. No, he cried as he reached out to her, but his fingertips could only grasp at the strings of her disappearing footsteps. I can't lose you. I cannot. You're the reason I cannot. He had spent his whole life in solitude for this reason. So why her, and why now? His last echoing thoughts. His throat felt raw when he swallowed. It felt like he was swallowing a dry pill. He needed her. She could cure him, but the truth covered her skin, which was a barrier that he could not break. The animal within taking over, he wanted to tear her skin open, to shred her flesh, to bleed all her truths. I can't. I need to know, but I can't. I would have my answer then, but then you would be dead, and I cannot. I can't, he said, slipping into quiet. Okay, author note here. I'm going to pause. I just realized I probably should have left that out because it's actually, this whole story is part of a whole bigger story. So that's where that's actually coming from. So if anybody's confused after hearing that, it's okay. It's not really supposed to be there. If you're reading the story by itself, then it's not really supposed to be there.
There's a few parts where it's like that. The black boot part, yeah. Anyway, that's all part of a whole nother story that's connected but not connected because of trademark legal reasons with involving Riot Games. So I can't connect them, unfortunately. Or Riot Games would own both the stories, which the set story, that's fine. That was just a blur of a story. But the main story, which is where that's actually connecting to, I want to own that. That's mine. So, anyway, that was just a side author note. And that's it for now.